Hey, this is Ken. I'm the media manager here at the WNC Military History Museum in Brevard, North Carolina. And today I just wanted to take a few seconds just to remember our beloved 41st President, George H.W. Bush. Now, Mr. Bush, or President Bush, is very important to the Military History Museum. Not only did he have a long career in politics, but he started as a naval aviator in World War II, and also probably had one of the most successful wars of all time, Operation Desert Storm. So we here are very saddened to hear of George H.W. Bush's passing. He was a great man, and I'm just going to take a few minutes to kind of just remember some of the things that George Bush has meant to us here at the Military History Museum. So, starting out, he was the 41st president, and he was also a vice president under Ronald Reagan. But something that I didn't know while I was doing the research this morning is that he was the director of the CIA. I can't believe that. I didn't even know that he was the director of the CIA, but he was. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as being an ambassador for the United States. Now, what really stands out in my mind about George H.W. Bush is that during World War II, I mean, he had graduated high school and was on his way to Yale University, been accepted, was ready to go to college when World War II broke out, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And the first thing he did was say, you know what, I'm going to put that on hold and I'm going to go join the Naval Reserve. And in doing so, he became the youngest pilot ever in the Navy. So, to me, that's the true sense of a hero. I mean, it's somebody that just, says there's a need. He could have gone to college. He didn't have to do what he did. But to be able just to put his life on hold and say, you know what, I'm going to defend freedom. And so we all know about how he became the youngest pilot. He was shot down in the Pacific. Could have died. I mean, he really, he could have died, and but he didn't, and he came back to, Yale, and finally finished his college degree, and then he became a representative for the state of Texas. He was in the House of Representatives for a long time, and to me, with the passing of John McCain and now George W. Bush, it tells me that really the best politicians are really veterans. Veterans make the best politicians. They know, what the sacrifices are. They know what, when they decide to send troops overseas, they know what they're getting their people into. So I really applaud, veterans for continuing to serve and, getting back and getting into politics. So obviously, he was a representative, then he was the ambassador to the UN, and then he was the director of the CIA, became the vice president. But it's really his accomplishments as our commander-in-chief that are really impressive. Even before the Operation Desert Storm, which everybody knows, the Gulf War, he already kind of started saying, dictators, we've had enough. Here in America, we just disagree with what most dictators do and how they conduct themselves and the human rights violations that dictators usually make. So, before Desert Storm, he came up with Operation Just Cause. And Operation Just Cause is when we invaded Panama and we removed Manuel Noriega. Now, Manuel Noriega was a drug lord, and some say that he was a spy for Cuba. But Bush took a stand right then and there and said, you know what, we're not going to deal with dictators. So We invaded Panama, which was another very successful invasion, or police action, as you want to call it. And then, you know, even before the Gulf War, President Bush was here. He basically ended the Cold War. You know, and that's a big part of my life growing up in the 80s and that sort of thing was, you know, World War III was always looming somewhere in the background. There was movies about it. There was Red Dawn. There was all these different, you know, movies of how we defeated the Soviets. But, you know, it's just a credit to George W. Bush on how he was able to meet with Gorbachev before, you know, obviously Ronald Reagan had laid the groundwork, but he was able to meet with Gorbachev, and that's when Gorbachev made the famous quote that we would never, ever start a hot war with the United States. And that was, he said that to George H.W. Bush. So I think it was pretty impressive that he was there for the end of the Cold War. So right there, he's been World War II, and then he's been a part of the Cold War, which is, you know, mostly of what's going on in the 20th century. Now, Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield in 1991 was just, it was an amazing part of history because it was the first war that we really had gotten into since Vietnam. And the way they decided to conduct themselves is just amazing. And the idea that George H.W. Bush wanted to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime. And the thing about it is that it was probably America's most popular war because I know I've done this before and I've showed you this before, but I've never seen trading cards, like baseball cards, like football cards on a war. But here we are, we have Operation Desert Storm trading cards. It's just unbelievable to me. So I'm going to show you a few of these in remembrance of George H.W. Bush. And the first one I got here is you know, President Bush himself sitting in a cabinet meeting, and this was a trading card. So, you know, I don't know. Was he the first president ever to be on a baseball card? Who knows? Anyway, but I just find it really interesting that obviously, and I've already talked about Gorbachev, and even Gorbachev has his own Desert Storm card. So when they were making these Desert Storm cards, they didn't forget George H.W. Bush's his contribution to ending the Cold War. And now I've got some other ones that I think you'll find really funny when it comes to Desert Storm. Like I said, obviously it was a popular war because people were buying things like these trading cards, and these characterizations here is our president knocking out Saddam Hussein right there. Isn't that amazing? And then we had another character of Mr. Bush taking a sword to Saddam. We are cutting your remarks. That's what it says on the back of the card. Oh, and this is a real classic. This is Rambush from the classic movie Rambo. They decided to draw George H.W. Bush as Rambush. Just an amazing time in history. You know, it's just crazy. And then, of course, we've likened Mr. Bush to John Wayne. So we've got our president dressed up like John Wayne, and it in the back of the card reads, Dance Pilgrim. So that's definitely John Wayne. Oh, this is another classic. This is another classic Sylvester Stallone movie, and it represents our president as arm wrestling Saddam Hussein. Over the Top, I believe, was the name of that movie. So that I thought that was pretty interesting that they would put our president arm wrestling. And then, of course, another reference to John Wayne. We got President H.W. Bush pointing a tank at Saddam Hussein going, "Make my day." And we all know what movie that was from. That was Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry. So, yeah, he was a very, very, very popular president. Even in the sports world, we had him as the quarterback sack. We sacked Saddam Hussein. And there's even one of our president as Superman. And he takes care of Saddam Hussein. So, and then one more last one that I have is In Your Face, dunking Saddam Hussein. So I don't think I've ever seen anything like this, this kind of propaganda before. Well, since World War II, actually. I mean, because they did make a lot of cartoons and stuff like that of the Nazis and that sort of thing. But the one thing about George H.W. Bush ending the Cold War, he ushered in a new era, and it's called the War on Terror. So even though he ended the Cold War that had been going on for, ever since the end of World War II, he ushered in a new era, and that was the War on Terror, which we are still fighting today. So basically, the War on Terror started with the invasion of Kuwait, pushing out the Iraqis in 1991. And it's still going on today. We're still in the middle of the War on Terror. And one of the things that tells us that the War on Terror has been continuing since 1991 is that the American Legion, if you're a veteran and you want to join the American Legion, there's certain different times. There's World War II, there's Korea, Vietnam, other different conflicts. But since 1991, if you have served in the military anytime after 1991, you are eligible to be in the American Legion. And that's because of the War on Terror, and that the War on Terror keeps going on. And obviously we saw the height of that during 9/11. But there was other things that Bush was also a part of. He had, after Desert Storm, he also had Operation Restore Hope. And that is where we see the beginnings of the problems that we had in Somalia, which culminated in Black Hawk Down. But, he decided he wanted to do humanitarian aid and no military force in Somalia at that time. And some people say, well, Mr. Bush was kind of soft. Why didn't he, when we invaded Kuwait, why didn't we drive Saddam, and why didn't we go all the way to Baghdad? He didn't do that because President Bush knew that if we did that we would have to occupy Baghdad, and we'd have to occupy the entire country of Iraq, which is kind of what we're doing now. So, being a World War II veteran and spending as much time in that as he had, he could see the future. He would not see the future, but he could predict the future, and he predicted what's going on right now in Iraq. Now, there's a few little details I'm gonna finish up with here. Some of these, did you know? Now, there's a few little details that I did not know about President George H.W. Bush. That on December 6th of 1991, Japanese Prime Minister apologized to President Bush for the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was happening, the 50th anniversary was the next day. And the next day, George H.W. Bush accepted the apology from the Japanese on the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, isn't that just, to me, that's just amazing. The man that stopped his life after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the man that put his life on hold to become a Navy aviator and to be the youngest Navy aviator that had served at that time, shot down in the Pacific, was the one to receive an apology for the attack that basically started his career. That's just amazingly, amazingly ironic to me. So with that, I'm going to end this little video, and I just want us to take a few minutes to honor and mourn our great President, George H.W. Bush. Godspeed, sir, and please rest in peace. Thank you.